So welcome everyone to today's discussion on overcoming cost and complexity. And thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm Dan McKinney from Cloudsmith, and I will be your host for what is sure to be an interesting and thought-provoking and hopefully a fun discussion as well. We've assembled a great panel today. And before I ask my guests to come on stage and introduce themselves, I just wanted to set the scene a little in terms of what we will be talking about. In the dynamic technological landscape that we exist in today, innovation and efficiency are really prime drivers for success. And it is crucial for us to navigate the challenges that arise from the choices we make, particularly when we look at things like tools and services, processes, open source solutions, and technical debt. As software developers or DevOps engineers, we're constantly faced with the ever evolving world of technology. And while this provides us with an abundance and sometimes maybe an overabundance of options and possibilities, it also presents us with a series of quite complex decisions. Now, these decisions range from selecting the right tools for our projects to managing the costs associated with their usage. Now, the cost factor has become increasingly significant in recent times. Everybody is a lot more cost conscious now. The demand for software and digital solutions still skyrockets. And this makes it very imperative for us to consider the financial implications of our choices. But how can we strike a balance between achieving our development goals and within budget? And how can we optimize our tooling choices to maximize the value we derive from our investments? Another challenge we encounter is the inherent complexity of the software development process itself. As the systems we build grow in scale and functionality, managing their intricacies becomes a daunting task. And technical debt arising from hasty or suboptimal decisions made during development can accumulate and hinder progress, affecting both the performance and stability of our applications. So, how can we address these complexities and reduce the burden? And amidst these challenges, open source solutions emerge not only to offer cost effective alternatives to proprietary tools, but also to foster collaboration and innovation and community driven development. So, by harnessing the power of open source, can we tap into a vast array of resources and leverage collective intelligence and mitigate the challenges of cost and complexity? So today we'll look at these issues and explore strategies for overcoming them. We'll discuss how to make effective tooling choices, considering factors such as functionality and cost and scalability and even support. And we'll delve into the hidden costs associated with tooling usage and try to identify some methods to optimize expenditure while maximizing productivity. Now, that's probably quite enough from me. So without any more from me, let's dive into the realm of cost and complexity. And let me kick things now by getting to know a little bit more about our guests. So I'll just ask them to join me on stage. Thanks, everyone, and welcome. Good to see you all.
Hello.
I guess I'll just pick on somebody then. Mel, would you like to go first and introduce yourself?
Okay. I am Mel, and I come to you from Melbourne in Australia. Sorry, it's really early here. So it's usually sunny in Australia, but it isn't right now because the sun hasn't risen. So that's where I am. I work for Buildkite. We are a CI/CD platform that is, different to other CI/CD platforms. And my mouth is over my name. We have a hybrid model, which is pretty interesting, but we'll talk about that later, I guess, at some point.
I'm sure we will.
And I'm a developer advocate. Before that, I was a software engineer. And actually, the topic of today's discussion is something near and dear to my heart, because that's why I got into software in the first place, to understand how to make things more efficient. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mel. Yeah, no, that's fine. And you have no idea how many times I nearly tripped over Mel from Melbourne. I mean that in all honesty. I did that so many times when I was practicing.
It's the airport code too. So in Slack, whenever anyone would put in Mel, I'm
They
going
get
to
the
Mel, I'd get a ping, and it's like, no, you're talking about the airport, not me. I don't know. I really should change that notification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mel, and thank you again for joining. I know it is very early for you, but well, thank you very much indeed. So
Thanks.
yes, I will pick
Glad to be here.
Shania next. I think we'll go to you. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'd love to. My name isn't an airport code, but I am Shania. I am currently one of the founders and CEO of a company called CodeSee. We help developers understand their code bases, which is the source of a lot of inefficiency. I've been in dev tools for 12 years, much older than I look. And really, basically, I've spent my entire career helping developers like myself, like make things more efficient. And one of the biggest sources of inefficiency is these darn code bases. They're so big and unruly, and legacy code bases. So I spent my every day 24/7 for the past several years trying to think about this exact problem and building a company to be able to solve it. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Shania. And yes, that is super relevant, right? Because that is exactly. I'm not going to throw any shade at anybody here, but that is where complexity arises. Those pesky code bases, as you say.
Totally.
I'm saying that like I have influence on them, and I don't. So no, but it is true. So thank you very much, and yes, thank you for being a part of this as well. And then last, but by no means least, especially because you are the only one in my time zone, Tamara, as well. So definitely by no means least, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. So I'm Tam. I'm currently working at Pragma platform, which is essentially a platform that is kind of like a back-end game engine for you to customize platform aspects of games. So things like matchmaking or inventory and that kind of thing. So if you're a game studio, we would probably be very relevant to you. If you're not a game studio, maybe not so much. But previously, I've been VP of engineering at places, and I've been in various SaaS and different video games spaces for almost 20 years now, which is crazy. But yes, and I'm currently based in London, despite my accent. And yeah, I guess so. So what I've been doing for Pragma is a lot of launch readiness aspects of that. So things like security and compliance, and helping prep them to prep game studios for their general availability launches and things like that. So, and I think like one of the things that I'm really interested to talk about today is about how stage of company will impact cost and complexity, because I very firmly believe that those things need to change. And before I delve too much into that, because I will get carried away, I will turn it
It's
back to
good.
you, Dan.
That's perfect. That's perfectly fine, and that's actually great. So yes, look, thank you very much for that as well, and again for being part of the panel today. So make no joke here when I say I do think this is the most global panel that I've ever been a member of. So we are spanning time zones from the UK to the West Coast to Australia. So that really truly global. So, but that's great to have everybody on board. So, look, thanks everyone for the introductions. Let's jump right in, okay? And we'll just start off. I'll just throw this out there as our first topic, because before we can really discuss cost and complexity and overcoming those, I think we really need to define some things, right? So what do we mean by cost? There are many kinds. And what do we mean by complexity? Again, there are many kinds. So just some examples, what we've seen ourselves, just share your thoughts on those two. I think we'll just start with costs. Who would like to go first in having an attempt at defining costs?
I could go first on that one. So I mean, there's the obvious one about money, because obviously things cost money. But I think somewhat less obvious than that are things like opportunity costs, when you're talking about, running a business, and if you're putting a lot of emphasis into one area versus another, that's an opportunity cost, because you're not able to do that first thing. So it's about what trade-offs are you making, as well as, developer costs, because if you choose to do something manually versus automating it, for example, that's going to take most likely a lot of time. And initially, and this kind of goes back to my point in my introduction about stage of business, something that you choose to do manually up front might actually be the quickest way to iterate, because it's not something that you have to do a lot of up front, and it might give you a chance to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself again, but please stop me if I am. But
No.
I think it's interesting because, you can iterate on a manual process, and then once, as you're scaling, you need to add more developers, more customers to it. That will get more complicated, so it's better to automate at that point. But if you don't spend the time initially to understand that, then there's a cost to you, because you might be optimizing or automating for the wrong thing. Which again is why that stage of business is really important. And yeah, there's other types of costs that I'm sure Mel and Shania could delve into. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we have a unique way of looking at costs. Yes, everything to what you said, right? But I think how long something takes to understand, based on like stage you said, is a way of defining complexity, right?
Yes.
So the only thing that we have to be able to optimize right now, and the only thing that's moving forward constantly, is time, right? That's the only thing we can't retroactively go back and change. And so how long does it take to actually understand something is a direct correlation with how complex that thing is, right? And so if we use tools and thought processes, we try to be able to optimize complexity with frameworks, best practices. Everybody has a different opinion. We have lots of tooling that kind of helps with this, but it's really about how long does it take you to understand the problem and therefore solve it. And that's kind of how I think about complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the cost one is a big one for me. Initially, you can think that it's just a simple problem. From my perspective, like our customers host their build agents on their own infrastructure. So you could think about infrastructure costs as a cost, which is a big one because it's usually a big price tag. But beyond that, I think there's so many elements to cost, especially maybe developer pain as a cost. And if you think that can span complexity as well, because developer pain is associated with complexity, cognitive load, all the things. But I think, say if you have, I don't know, I'm just pulling something out there, like slow, inefficient test suites, right? That is a developer cost because they're sitting there, they've got a failure, it's failing for a reason they can't see immediately. They start digging in, they can't understand if it's a real failure or if it's a flaky test, like just the complexity of that in itself, and providing the right information at the right time, making it so they're not sitting there for an hour stuck on something, that's a cost. So there's that cost. There's also the cost of, I like to think of the DevOps, philosophy of like having teams working harmoniously together. And inefficiency can also come from the, inefficiency, and cost comes from like not being a single team that spans like multiple silos in your organization, and like having people work harmoniously together, or at least understand each other's problems and understand how they can help each other, is a cost as well. So there's so many facets to cost that I love unpacking. But yes, there's no simple answer for cost. There's costs everywhere. I guess prioritizing which ones you want to.
Would you say that understanding cost is complex?
Yes, it's complexity. Hey, you trapped us.
I also think as well. I mean, they are you can't really unlink them, right? So they're joined sort of permanently at the hip. Now I do think they are slightly different. And one example that I thought recently was, and I'd seen this in the past, was organizations that had, they built a lot of complexity into the applications they were running and also their development processes. One thing that it wasn't immediately obvious was, but when they tried then to onboard new engineers, the time for those people to become productive was really obscenely long, right? And that's just shows the direct relationship between something being overly complex and a direct cost, of course, the money cost, but also the cost in time just of lost productivity while that person was onboarding. So that's not one that is, when we talk about cost, people immediately think of a cloud provider bill or a dollar figure, but it does manifest in many more ways than that, and it is a complex topic. I want, if I could just pull back a little bit, I just wanted to dig into that topic, Tamara, that you brought up at the start, which was really related to the stage that an organization's at, or the sort of size of an organization, because I think really that's also a scale issue there, and Mel, you would probably recognize this example. So I spoke to an organization a while ago. Actually, they were very concerned that their CI processes, they were very sensitive even to things taking an additional minute or two, because if they had 10,000 jobs running, that's 10,000, 20,000 minutes of compute time that they're going to use, and they wanted to look at that efficiency. So that's one end of that scale of small, medium, large organizations. But I wanted to pull back to that to say, for a smaller organization, so for a startup organization, what do you folks think would be the most not important, because all costs are important, but the costs and the complexities that people should focus on first at that early stage? What are your thoughts there? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I definitely think that kind of two things, what was kind of very small points that we talked about, in my opinion, for a small startup are very, very important. Cross team communication, even if you have 2 to 3 people, getting all of that down as quickly as possible is really important. And then the other one, when you talked about onboarding, that cost is actually a symptom, and the root cause problem is actually code visibility. Being able to see, visualize, and grab the information. I think, Mel, you said this, at the exact right time when you need it, is one of the biggest root cause problems that, if you get it right as a startup, will only help you as you scale. And there are lots of tools out there. This is a shameless plug for CodeSee, but CodeSee actually solves this exact problem, which is why I know that this is really, really helpful, whether you use CodeSee or not, right?
Sure.
We work with tons of small startups, and we've seen the repercussions of not having code visibility from day zero, even whether it's in your cloud system or even in your application. Right. So CodeSee only does the application code visibility, but we're seeing that whether it's in your cloud or not, you get those right. You get the documentation right. You get, whether it's visual or written or AI documentation, you get all of that right. Everything will infinitely scale because everyone has a unified picture of how something works.
Yeah.
Right? If you have a unified picture, everything becomes easier.
I think
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, I haven't really worked at any small, I haven't worked at a startup as such, like 3 people, 4 people building the thing. But I've worked at, I've joined later where they've become the scale up and they're living with the pain of the decisions or the things that they didn't have in place early. So there's that trade-off between how early do we optimize, because I don't believe in that. I believe in feeling a pain before you solve the problem. Going back to engineering practices where you don't optimize too early because you don't understand the problem. But it's like, how do you put in those foundational things like Shania was talking about, especially like the documentation, like building those processes into the way that you move early, and also just having psychological safety to call things out and have a great team that works together, that's diverse, that understands there might be tension, but it's safe and cool. Those are the foundational things that will help you scale, I think. Besides, I mean, there's tooling choices, obviously, but I think providing insights, quick insights, observability, getting the foundations right, I think would allow you to not have to have someone coming in at a stage where they've already grown and everything's already exploded. I mean, that's a byproduct of success, which is a great place to be.
It's a good, it's a Good
It'd
problem
be
to have.
great to avoid it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that chime, Tamara, do you think? Does that sort of sound?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the tricky thing is, how do you understand what that is, right?
Right.
And I think to well, to the points of both of you, having that foundational aspect is really important. And I think the best way to know what some of that might look like is building a vertical slice, right? Like
Mhm.
I was talking to a founder a couple weeks ago, and they were telling me how they had an engineer who's really wanting to build things from the ground up and build everything from the platform level all like at before going to business logic. And I'm like, but how are you testing that out? How are you able to do prototyping and actually understand how the core aspects of your product are going to work? And I think there's also the balance between some of those foundational aspects and making sure that you're not spending all your time on and I think this is, just to be clear, what Mel and Shania are saying is like the right foundational aspects, because
Yes.
things like visibility and understanding how aspects of your system interact and where interdependencies are, and having that visibility is what I think a lot of what Shania is talking about and what Mel's talking about is what the best practices are that will enable you to move faster as you scale as a business. And I think mapping those things with the the customer and product perspective and not losing sight of that, because if you're able to build an actual MVP, you
Mhm.
can test that out and see if you have product market fit and all those things that you need to actually keep the business alive.
Yeah.
um, but I think, as engineers, there is that tendency to work on the shiny and the really
Yeah.
Of course.
interesting, gnarly
Of course.
problems in the back
Microservice,
end.
all the
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But that's
Of
it. It's
course.
like, actually, I was going to bring up microservices as well, because obviously, like, there's a lot of
Mhm.
benefit for
Mhm.
microservices. And I think, as you were mentioning the pain, Mel, like,
I think you
I
need the
think we've,
monolith to understand your business
yeah,
domain first. Then you feel the
yeah,
pain. Then you make logical decisions based on the pain. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. What's really, really funny is that I am constantly in this monolithic SOA like conversation. And I just did a podcast because we're having actually more customers go backwards the other
Yeah.
direction. And so
Same.
Yes.
why,
Yeah.
yeah, right. Where you're like, oh, everyone had this microservice like thing. Actually, like, let's go back. Like, there was a lot of really good things about
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
having a monolith. There are a lot
Yeah.
of benefits to that trade-off.
Yeah.
And so it's really about all you're really trying to do. The thing that is the root cause, is particularly if you're an early startup, like I said, is like visibility
yeah,
and cross-team
Exactly.
communication. How can you
Mhm.
get the visibility that you need, and how do you talk about it? Those
Yeah.
are really the
Monolith.
foundational things.
Exactly. Monolith or like microservices, the problem is still the same. It's like, how do people understand what's happening and how do they work together? Like, that's
Mhm.
really it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, like, going to the stage of business thing, as
Yeah.
businesses grow from one team, when you're 20 people, you can keep that conversation going really easily. But
Mhm.
as the business grows and you have more teams, it becomes harder to keep that conversation going. So how do
Yeah.
you scale that to make
Mm.
sure that you're talking to each other? And I think, I've led a lot of platform teams and infrastructure teams and DevOps teams, and I think a very common thing is, if there's an issue between that team and one of the, like, feature teams or product teams, it's often because that conversation has stopped happening. And the way to solve it is, let's get that visibility, let's get that conversation going again, and then the problem tends to go away and everyone's happy again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I think that's totally accurate, Tamara. So I've been in several organizations when they were at the sort of 6, 7 person stage. You're right. Communication there is almost, you don't really need to think about it because the entire organization joins calls every day. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. Visibility is super important. Now, I have a natural bias here because at Cloudsmith, we're all about visibility on your dependencies and packages, right? But I always say that if you can't see the things, then you can't put controls or processes around them, right? It is that simple. And I've heard this not just I've heard it everywhere, from not capturing enough logs to figure out what a problem is. Oh, we're only sampling 10%, we need more. To not just having the documentation in place, to not having a process documented. And I think the one thing that constant is that there's always change, right? But if you put those foundations in place, then when you do scale, and you want to swap your database out underneath your application for something else, you want to change your front end framework. If you've put the foundations in place, you have everything clear that people know what was there, then that makes those changes easier to implement as well. If you don't have that, again, that's that thorny complexity piece where nobody really wants to touch anything because nobody's sure what was there, and you'd be amazed even how many times I talk to Cloudsmith customers and they're like, we need to bring all of these artifacts to Cloudsmith because we don't really know which ones we still need and which ones we don't. So we have to just store everything, and you're like, well, we can help with that. But, that's been going on for years. And that's a visibility problem. They don't know what they have. And then, of course, they can't have control. So, yeah, no, yeah, I know I'm only supposed to host, but that's super interesting. And I was thoroughly enthralled with everything everybody was saying. So I suppose, actually, this is a good point for me to just move it on to my next topic, because a couple of you said something very interesting there, which is, right, engineers are going to engineer, right? Engineers are going to build things. That's what we need engineers to do, is build things. That's what they are great at, and that's what they excel at. So the natural question then comes, when you're looking at tools for your development pipelines or your development processes, should you build or should you buy, right? Because we've all seen instances of both, right? And I just wanted to delve in a little bit. This is opinion-based. Some of it is experience-based. What have you seen, or what do you think? The build versus buy argument is one that could probably have a whole panel discussion by itself. But just trying to keep it linked to cost as effectively and complexity, they're tied together. So build versus buy. Tamara, I'd like to just start with you on that, because you made the very good point about building the shiny. I think Mel started it, but you said that, so I'm going to go back to that. So
Sure.
yes.
I mean, this is one I struggle with, because I think like there's so many, like you talk specifically about pipelines, right? And that I think there's so many good companies out there that offer CI/CD pipelines and different tooling around
Yeah.
that
Yep.
like, not naming names, but but there are so many out there, and it feels like this is one where why would I try to reinvent the wheel? And unless my business is also core around specifically pipelines, why would I build it?
Mhm.
And I think it would require a very, very good argument for me to agree with, yes, okay, let's build our own from scratch. I think there's a difference there between customizing something that exists and having a certain level of ownership over pipelines, depending, because you want to make sure if that's like a core thing for your business and you're constantly you don't want it to go down, because otherwise then no one can do any work and things like this. So there are arguments to make sure that you have ownership over aspects of those pipelines. But building it from scratch, convince me if anybody wants.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I get it. I totally get it.
I think we span the middle ground there, where it's like part of we offer the hybrid system, which is like, we're not GitHub Actions, we're not like in your repository, we're not plug and play. Circle CI is pretty low barrier to entry. But I think where we sit is at that sweet spot where it's like you architect your own build infrastructure and you have so much control over so much. It's like a bag of Lego and you just bolt it together and you can configure it to suit your business needs. With that comes some complexity. but also control over the things that you might need. So it's not building your own, but it's like having the control that you need at a certain point, I feel like, in the journey. But yeah, I think choosing the right tool for the right problem that you're trying to solve is always one of those things. And I would never advocate for someone to use something that's way more complex than what they need at the time.
Sure.
If you're two people and you don't feel pain and this works for you, use somebody else's tool. And if you feel a pain, that's when you look elsewhere. That's my golden rule. It's you don't build your own ever unless you really feel a pain that the other thing can't solve. Yeah.
As someone, I've built a general purpose tool from scratch for thousands of customers at this point. And we have a really good framework that we think about when it comes to build versus buy. The first thing that you need to kind of understand is what are the business goals? First, once you write down the business goals, I feel like everyone should kind of understand that. But what are the non-negotiables as far as build versus buy?
Absolutely.
What is, and then you kind of make sure you write that down versus build versus buy. And then you want to think about resourcing. And then you want to add what we call the complexity visibility tax on top of that, because everything is going to be more complicated than you think it's going to be. Whether you've got
how hard can it be?
Right, exactly.
It'll be simple.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to just take this amount of time, etc. And so when you think about it, and then you want to multiply that by how many people and how much time you're going to it's going to take to actually not only build the initial version, but also maintain it. And then you want to add a separate line item around employee retention, right? So how you kind of want to add a tax to that, right? And because people leave jobs and people change roles, they get promoted, right?
Sure.
All sorts of things, right? And so those are kind of the bullet points that we work through with customers. You'd be very, very surprised about how many people I talk to that are like, I tried to build a code visualization system so I can visualize all my applications, and that was really hard. And we're like, we know, that's kind of, it's really, really hard to do when you don't spend all of your time doing a particular goal when that goal is not your main business goal.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of the framework that we think that we help customers think through. Because if all of that actually makes sense, which is less than our cost, we're like, great, awesome, high five, go do what you do. But those are kind of the points and how we help customers think about it.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I 100% agree, and I love that framework. I'm gonna steal the
I need it. Yeah.
visibility tax. That's
really good.
But just to add one thing to it is also the cost of managing. So if you're going for a managed service versus having to hire someone in-house, this might feel like an old school example, but it was not that long ago. I worked at a place where, internally they had an Exchange server, and it was a very, very modern engineering company, but the Exchange server was managed in-house. Now with Office 365 and all of that, maybe it's not an issue anymore, but there are still lots of places who run that. And ultimately there was a decision that was, we're not an email company. We're not a communications company. We're a video games company. So we are going to switch to Gmail or whatever other managed service and make sure that is out of our hands, because it's not something that is anywhere remotely close to our business logic. Yeah.
Also, that brings to mind that you wouldn't want to be on the hook for all that customer data if it wasn't or PII data if it wasn't your sweet spot and your expertise. I think security is always the non-negotiable, and assessing which tools you choose should be informed by Is this our area of expertise, and can we ensure that we keep people's information safe? Probably not.
That said, because I love that point, and I also 100% agree with that. But I encountered an HR tool that is, very much not part of our core business, so it's not something that we want to be on the hook for, whatever. But they had a default setting about email that was like, oh, we'll help automate all of this and take all of your information about certain things from your email and put it in the tool. But the way that it did that was by actually importing every
Accessing it all.
single email from the company and putting it there. And then there was a different level of access control in that tool versus like G Suite, which is something that's like you have to be careful when you're also pulling in these
Yeah.
third-party tools and
Yeah.
making sure that you're evaluating, is this
Absolutely.
do I trust this third-party tool to handle
That's
my
right.
PII?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. I think that's a fantastic point on the managed service, Tamara. Look, as a former Microsoft Exchange admin in a manufacturing company, I completely agree with you. This was a manufacturer. I was working for. We had no business running our own email servers. It was a legacy sort of holdover, but moving to Office 365 freed me personally up to do more work on the line of business applications that actually facilitated manufacturing the product, right? So a really good point, and forgive me, I can't remember who said it almost like this, but I think it was actually you, Shania. If what you're building isn't core to your own product or business, don't build it. Buy it in, and preferably buy it as a managed service. That's just my personal feeling on that. I've seen this again with Cloudsmith customers who come to us. They say, we gave all of our teams, autonomy to build their own sort of tool sets. Some of them are using some open source solutions for artifact management. Some of them have another proprietary solution for artifact management. What happened was they then, had this sort of disjointed series of tools, all fulfilling sort of one job. Some even built their own in-house artifact management solutions. I'd never advocate that at all.
I have worked with one of those.
Yeah, it's more common. It's more common than you think.
Oh my god, the amount of times we couldn't pull down our packages.
Exactly, right? And there's the cost again, Mel, right? Because that's lost time. So we do hear this quite a bit, and I do think, obviously, of course, full disclosure, I have my own bias, but even internally at Cloudsmith, we make use of a lot of managed services. We do, because they're not core to our business, which is building a universal package management solution. So we're not going to go down that path and use our engineering resources and create something that we're also going to have to maintain, and possibly at some point in the future move away from. And it is a real time sink and cost sink. So I'm a big advocate of the buy. Just buy, don't build your own product, right? Focus on your own product and leave the other things up to the people who've decided to make a product out of that, and be that managed service. So yes, that sounded like a bit of a rant. I didn't mean it to sound that way, but I've just spoke to so many people that have got themselves in a mess in this way, and I've seen, I've seen the pain. Yeah, I've seen the pain. So yeah, no, that's interesting, I have to say. I suppose just one thing before I move away from that. Is there ever an argument, if you are at that very small stage, if you are, moving fast, iterating quickly, trying to get an MVP out the door, is there an argument to build something quickly? Maybe you just don't have budget to buy a proprietary solution or some kind of managed service. Is that a stage that you're at? And if so, any tips on sort of minimizing the impact of that and sort of just setting yourself up for more success, even if you do decide to throw some things together sort of quickly to get something out the door? Anything there?
I like Shanea's framework for deciding that. I think that's perfect, because still really you need to be asking, why are we doing this?
Yes.
And why and how much does it cost? And you kind of need a calculator to work that out, because developers are going to try and build the thing. That is inevitable. Oh, shiny, cool. This sounds like an interesting problem.
I think that's fair. Well, I do think, I think that's fair, right? Because of course it's very tempting to say, oh, look, we need we need something to do X. Oh, look, I've found this little open source project. We can just take that, fork it, modify it, and that's great if you're 3 people. I
Yeah.
do think you try to quantify it, though. I agree with that. I do think you should try and quantify it, because you need to look to the future a bit, and it's not always going to be just the 3 of you, and it's not always going to be that you just need something that doesn't have a commercial cost associated with it. Those things change,
I
so
think always we forget how easy it is to actually, like, it always seems easier when you're like, why didn't I think of that? But it's always like taking that step back and asking the why. Like, why am I doing this? Why are we deciding to go this way? And like you go, oh, why are we? That doesn't even seem right. But like, unless you take that step back objectively and bring people into the room who may have a different perspective to you, have the discussion. Honestly, I think you find that often you come to the right decision if you take the time to ask why, rather than just dive in, pull that open source project, include it, fork it, then have to maintain it forever. And it's forked, and you don't, get the benefits of all the security upgrades and all the things. Yes.
You've just owned it. Yeah.
I think it's that, and like making sure the right people are in the room, because if, for example, if you're an infrastructure team and you're making a decision on behalf of every other development team and you're not listening to, what their needs are, then you are probably going to end up with the wrong result. And like I've definitely seen that multiple times before, and like sometimes it's, oh well, we know best because we're also developers, so it's fine. But no, like every team will work somewhat differently, and I think getting those requirements, like treating the rest of the company as stakeholders and customers, really
Absolutely
is important.
Yeah. I like borrowing from that SLO model for that kind of like untangling of the why. It's like, get all those people in the room if they're using or relying on a system, particularly if it's an infrastructure team, and just be like, what do we all expect from this thing? Can we all agree that this is the goal for this? And then you set your SLO and you start measuring it. But it's not until you do those things with everybody in the room that you understand. And usually the needs align in some way, but like I can't think of a system example, but like there's people that use the system, there's people that maintain the system, and their needs are slightly different. But if you can all agree on the one thing that's important, and usually it's like uptime or, speed or whatever, but you set that goal and then you just measure it. If you have that, that's clarity.
Yeah, but typically, like if we go back to kind of our earlier point about the size of startup versus the larger one, if you're 3 people, because your business hasn't hit a certain milestone or metric, that should be the only goal, essentially. And then once you get past a certain threshold, then you can think about other optimizations, particularly in the economy like it is today, right? Like those, you have to kind of, even engineers have to think about like their roles within companies right now, because everyone's trying to optimize, right? And so I think that's kind of breaking it down like that. And you might make a different decision if you're a small startup in today's economy than in like 2021's economy, 2020's economy, right? So I think having that framework that I laid out earlier, and then maybe thinking about like today versus like the next 6 months, and kind of thinking about the goals in that time frame, as opposed to being like, oh, if everything turns around in 3 years, right? Like trying to make decisions based on
steps.
Exactly. No one can predict the future.
No, they certainly cannot. But you did a very good job there, Shania, because I was about to say our next topic, actually, the next topic I wanted just to bring in, but you sort of touched on it, and it's fantastic. It was almost like you set this up for me. Really, and we all talk about this all the time, but this is definitely relevant here. Data-driven decisions, right? So using data to sort of drive those decisions that we're talking about. Really, what I guess I mean by that is, would everybody share some examples of the kind of data that they would like? Now, you made a very good point, Shania, which was if you're a 3-person company and you haven't hit a certain milestone, that metric is really your prime mover. That's the one that you want to sort of focus on. That's at the very one end of the spectrum, very small end. But there's all kinds of metrics and there's all kinds of data. But when trying to judge, the cost impact and the complexity impact in terms of people, code bases, all that, there's a vast spectrum of metrics, but just some kinds of data that you've seen, or your framework is an excellent place to start, Shania. That's why I picked on you. So that's a great place to start, but we'll go around the room sort of. But yes, that's what I would love to just delve into, some examples of the kind of data and things that people should be measuring to help make these decisions.
Yeah, we're actually, I know this is another plug a little bit, but something that we've been really, this is my whole life. I spend all of my time.
That's not a problem. Not a problem.
So I have very strong opinions. We're thinking of something that we've been playing around with a lot of our big enterprise customers, called a maintainability index.
Okay.
And
Okay.
basically, a maintainability index is a combination of some smaller bullet points all kind of added together. And basically, what it is we've all even earlier said that visibility is one of the main problems. Like, that is the root cause problem in engineering, because typically what we spend 60% of our time day to day trying to understand our code bases. Like, that's just a fact. And so how to correlate how complex your code base is with the time that it takes to actually understand it and solve problems is something that no one can measure at this moment. And we're trying to measure it because it's really, really important. As we've all discussed, many of our problems stem from this one problem. And so if we can solve that, a lot of other things get easier. And so some of those bullet points might be documentation coverage. Those might be dependencies. I think, Tamara, you mentioned this, like measuring the number of dependencies within a code base, being able to figure out review time, like how long does it, like time to first commit, time to last commit, ship, merge commit, being able to take all of those things as a proxy, add it together where you're over a certain threshold to come up with whether an ABC grade. That's something that we're thinking about as far as how do you quantify code visibility. And then once you get yourself kind of over those thresholds, then you can do what we tend to tell customers is you can make rules against it, right? Mm-hmm. Once you have visibility, you can add a rules engine on top of that, that will allow you to scale that infinitely. So all of that code knowledge, all of those visibility diagrams, all of that, self-updating documentation will scale with you, and hopefully that opportunity cost will drop down. So that's something that we've definitely been thinking about, that the industry needs as a whole, in my opinion.
I really like that.
So do I.
It sounds amazing. Please tell me when you have it. So I would add on to that, because I think you kind of touched on this with, like, how long does it take to review something? And I think that is largely going to indicate complexity, but it might not. It might indicate that an engineer is taking way too long to actually check something in and ask for a review, which is a slightly different problem than complexity, but they're related often. So the thing that I've probably talked about this before, and it just really annoys me that a lot of companies will look at the wrong metrics because they end up incentivizing entirely the wrong behavior, and they'll just be like, oh yeah, like so and so is the best engineer because they've committed this number of lines of code or this number of commits in a period of time, but that doesn't mean they're good commits, right? So I think when we're looking at maintainability, we also need to look at number of regressions. Are you actually also writing unit tests and how many of those tests pass, what is the test pass rate, and once you do deploy, do you have to roll that back? And
Mhm.
I think those are really key metrics around maintainability and cost, because it goes back to what you were talking about as well, Mel, because of the developer pain. Nobody wants to have to redo something. Like, we don't want to have to fix loads of bugs, but if we're not keeping track of some of that stuff, then that's all that we'll end up doing. So I think those are really key areas, because yeah, it hopefully will drive down both cost and complexity if you're
Yeah.
measuring them and incentivizing engineers to do things in the right way, because it's not about number of lines of code written, it's about the quality of that code.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think
Preach.
like your yeah, right? To
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
point, like I think we as an industry have come to this conclusion, like we optimize for in like sometimes incorrect metrics for two reasons.
Yeah.
One, we've never had a good metric to begin with. So we use all these proxy metrics,
Yeah.
right, to
Mhm.
kind of get it because measuring it is really hard.
Yeah.
Um, and the other one that we don't really think about is the ability to make sure that we have a good measure of code bases as they change, because
Yeah.
today's code base and how you'd measure it, maybe if you're a small startup, like how many lines of code you're writing is helpful. Maybe, but as your code base changes, as you're thinking about refactoring that code base, right? Like as you're thinking about, adding a new feature, right? As you're thinking about breaking something down to be more performant and more efficient, like as the need, your code base is actually a living organism, right?
Mhm.
And as we as people age, we might like measure like, oh, how tall we're getting one day, but then eventually like we stop and we have other measures like how old are we getting, right? So like
Nailed it.
That's
thinking
such
Yeah.
a
about
good analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
yeah.
Brilliant.
Can you tell I spend a lot of time thinking about this? I think we don't have a measure of that, right? Like
Yeah.
we didn't have a good measure in the first place, and we don't have a measure of how how to measure our code base as it grows up and as it changes. That's why
Mm.
we are in the position that we're in today, where no one can measure it efficiently.
Yeah. I think that one's a good one. Like, firstly, there's been leaps and bounds, and observability is the new word, right? And it's like,
Yep. Yep.
as you change, you don't know what questions you might want to ask or what you need to
Mhm.
know. So, setting that
Yeah.
up as the platform for how you look at what complexity is, or like what speed is, or whatever, have the metrics that you need before you need them, right? Because it's too late to
Mhm.
go, we think this is important, oh, we haven't been collecting that data. Then you've got to have the ramp up to get the data. So that's kind of cool. I like the I'm thinking, for us, for the people that I mostly work with, it's like always like things like build minutes, or
Sure.
test suite
Mhm.
reliability, or
Mhm.
they're the numbers that care to their teams that I talk to a lot. And I think I've seen some pretty amazing things, like once they have the data there, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I think the build minutes one was incredible, because I think it was a newly released like thing on our API, and a team requested it, we did it. They're like, they managed to optimize their builds just by knowing what the number was. I think they saved 10,000 hours per month
Wow.
per. Now, I don't know if I've got my zeros right,
I
but it
don't
was a
know.
big number, and it made me go,
That's okay.
oh, and it was
That's
per
okay.
developer. Like, it was something crazy.
Yeah.
Just by understanding that number and having that insight, then they could tune the system, right? But unless
Yeah.
you know the number, can't quantify the pain. I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
Can't
That's it.
quantify the
Mhm.
pain.
No.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Look, that is exactly it. Now, as Shania said about the code complexity and code bases, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's maybe the number one reason that when I talk to Cloudsmith users, the reason they came to Cloudsmith was to get that visibility over dependencies that they're pulling in and dependencies from public package sources. But they want that visibility. They want to be able to see and measure, right? Measure what's coming in and what packages they're consuming. Um, at the moment they just don't know, right? And but it is all down to the first thing they want is to be able to see it, right? And then they can decide on good metrics on top of that, right? And they maybe they'll pick some bad ones first and iterate over that, and that's fine. But without that initial observability, and it is the hot thing at the minute, Mel, you're right. It is the hot thing. We talk about this so much now.
I think it's such a good evolution though, because it's like before that we were flying blind. We were really just fumbling around going, that feels bad, but you didn't know why or what.
Couldn't quantify it. Yeah. It was hard to quantify. And some things are harder than others to quantify. But no, I totally, I really accept that. I do, I do, absolutely. I've just noticed I think we're running a little low on time, folks. So as much as we could continue, because the time
there's so much more
flew by. There's so much more. I feel we hardly scratched the surface. No, I really do. No, but look, I suppose I'll just take this opportunity to say that, actually, just to say, look, really that was a super short discussion and a super high level discussion. There is so much more that we could talk about. We could probably have picked any one of those topics and spent the entire talk just on that alone. But time waits for none of us, and it has caught up with us. So I should take this opportunity just to say, in closing, I think we all agree that cost and complexity is complex. Is a joke I should make there, probably. But they are sort of, you can't unlink them. And the decisions that you take early in the process are the most important to set those foundations in place. Also, that having a framework, as demonstrated by Shania, is also a really good thing that will set you up to be able to measure and make those decisions based on those data-driven decisions. Now, that was a 1-minute summary of what I think we talked about. I hope it wasn't too far off the base. Very hard to distill that down into one sentence. I suppose just any closing comments anybody wants to make just before I sort of wrap up? Anything at all?
I just want to say,
we've all got a closing comment.
I just, I think starting simple, even if manual, and then automating. And I think in our prep for this talk, someone said, and I'm sorry if I steal your thunder, but I wrote it down because I really liked the phrasing, automate with understanding. I think this may have been Shanea's, and
it wasn't me. It wasn't me. No, I think it was Shania.
But I think all of those things you did. I'm sorry, I stole it, but it's so good. And I think,
you have it.
But I think it really sums a lot of this up, is like, that understanding. None of what we talked about works effectively if we don't have understanding. I will be quiet now.
I was pretty much just going to say that too, but not as good as you. So I was just going to be like, get in the room and unpack the why together, like set some goals. Always make considered decisions with everybody involved, or everybody that makes sense to be involved. Yeah.
I genuinely think that's real sage advice. The why is so important. It really is. So, well, folks, honestly, it's been a pleasure.
Let Shania say hers.
Oh, yes, of course.
Shania, just because I stole hers doesn't mean she needs.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
she's not off the hook.
No, okay. I was gonna say that any size company should probably use Cloudsmith and CodeSee to get started. Like, it seems like a lot of problems can be solved with visibility, and I know this for a fact, that a lot of our problems, observability is just visibility in production, and visibility is observability in development. It's all solving the same problems. You get those two kind of going, if you are at a big company, you're going to need it. We're probably already feeling it, because everybody does. If you don't have a hello world application, you feel this problem. And so I feel like that's probably the easiest takeaway from this conversation. Automate with understanding.
That's the one. That's the one. Yes, I agree with that. Oh, well, I honestly, I couldn't agree more. Look, personally, folks, I learned a lot, on this call. It's great to hear different opinions. Even when we all think that we have an opinion on a topic, everybody does have a slightly different take. And I find that super refreshing. I know that I hear constantly from just one side, the kind of users and customers that I deal with. So it's brilliant to open that up a bit and hear everybody else's opinions. Super interesting to me. I wish we had longer, but I do have to keep us to time at some point. I'll have to wrap up. So I should just, yes, look, I just want to thank you all again sincerely for your time and your thoughts and your expert opinion. I couldn't possibly do it without you. And I think, yeah, all that's left to say is, again, thank you very much. I'll just hand things back over to Alan, ready for the next talk. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.